I was reading this morning on the news, because now you get the news online mostly, or certainly I do, that in New York City, cab drivers are now being requested/required to find out what the personal pronoun is for the passengers that they're carrying. How did we get here? Okay, well, that's part of what we'll talk about. Last week we talked about some aspects of the roots of socialism in our nation. Today I want to talk about the law, how the law has changed. In 1956, Congress passed a law, basically. We changed the Pledge of Allegiance under Dwight D. Eisenhower. It was the aftermath of the Korean War and World War II. And we added just a few words, under God, one nation under God. And then 8 years later, prayer was taken out of the schools. It became against the law to pray. How did that happen in such a short period of time? When you look at the changes we've seen in our nation over the last century, it turns out that there are three tenured areas that have been key to that change. The first one is the courts. Supreme Court justices are tenured, and most justices, to some degree or another, have some form of tenure in their position. You have education, where most professors are tenured, and so they have incredible freedom once they have achieved their tenure. And then the press, if you think about it, is really tenured, protected by the First Amendment in what they say. And so if someone can successfully, not necessarily someone, but if some viewpoint can successfully influence and perhaps even control those three organs, you wind up ultimately changing the culture. But even just changing the law all by itself changes the culture. When Roe v. Wade was passed, suddenly abortion was the law of the land. In every state, in virtually every city, people could go and have abortions. The change in taking prayer out of the public schools was significant, because now a child could now go around and could grow up not knowing that there is a God who sees him even with the things that he may do in the dark. Well, today I'd like to talk about how the Bill of Rights has been rewritten, how that was done, because clearly it has. First of all, there's ignorance of history. A December 2019 poll showed that 70% of millennials would prefer or accept a socialist government in the United States of America. 67% of American millennials cannot identify what Auschwitz is. That's according to a study released on Holocaust Remembrance Day this past year, finding that knowledge of the genocide that killed 6 million Jews during World War II is not very robust amongst American adults. 22% of millennials in the poll said they haven't heard of the Holocaust or are not sure whether they've heard of it. Twice the percentage of U.S. adults as a whole who said the same. Millennials are the only age group in America in which a majority views socialism favorably. A National Reason Group survey found that 53% of Americans under 30 have a favorable view of socialism, compared with less than a third of those over 30. And Gallup found that an astounding 69% of millennials are willing to vote for a socialist candidate for president. The reason I classify this as ignorance of history is that socialism has not been a net plus for those who have gone full bore to a socialist state. Venezuela, Cuba being just a few of the recent illustrations. But then we look at America, the United States of America, and what is the source of the greatness here? Well, a short distance from here, one of the greatest achievements in the history of mankind transpired when we sent men to the moon. A dream of the ages, fulfilled in our lifetime. We have been the model for other nations to emulate, whether it's Microsoft or Apple, the transistor, or penicillin, the good old USA has been the pioneer. It has been the safe haven for refugees from around the world. We have walls to keep people out, not to keep them in. An amazing thing in the history of the world. And it has been the USA through 2 world wars and numerous regional conflicts, sacrificially saving large parts of the world from totalitarianism and suffering. It was the USA that gave an olive branch and a hand up to rebuild Europe and Japan. What nation rebuilds their strongest enemies after they have vanquished them? It is the USA who consistently outgives other nations to help those in need. So we have to ask, where did this incredible and unique preeminence come from? Alexis de Tocqueville, a French historian studying America in the 1800s, concluded it came from the churches. We were founded by men and women of deep faith who prayed across denominational lines and begged God to intervene in their defense. And God answered those prayers. On September 6, 1774, almost 2 years before the colonies formally declared independence from Great Britain, the Continental Congress made its first official act, a call for prayer. And on May 16, 1776, the Continental Congress appointed an official national day of fasting and prayer for the colonies. The Declaration of Independence that was composed a few short months later, and America, were founded as a direct result of that prayer. In 2 Chronicles 7:14, God says, "If my people shall humble themselves and pray and turn from their wicked ways, I will hear their prayer and heal their land." And they did. And he did. And we sit here today in a free nation, a free country. But our freedoms are threatened if we change the foundation upon which the company, or the country rather, was built. They were pursuing a new paradigm, the new paradigm of self-government. 56 men made a pledge to one another and to God to live or to die to free this nation when they signed the Declaration of Independence. Quote, "For the support of this declaration, with firm reliance on the protection of the divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." They made the revolutionary statement that governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. It was revolutionary. The thought was revolutionary. Certainly, it drove a revolution, but it was a new thought in the history of the world. Before these men, power always came from might. Kings were thought to be established in place by God. So the Declaration of Independence is indeed an appeal to God, defending the righteousness of their actions in casting off the bonds of the king. All men, they wrote, are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, amongst which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. King George, therefore, had no right to take these God-given rights away. It was a theological argument that they were making, and it was a document that was intended to defend themselves before men, but even more before God. And this new paradigm of self-government was specifically designed for an altruistic and religious people. George Washington said this, quote, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other," unquote. That was in his farewell address in 1796. They grappled with a real problem as they were debating the constitution of this new nation. And the problem was this: in this bold experiment to have people governing their own country, how can we trust in the people if they cannot govern themselves as individuals? And so what they concluded was the most critical thing to do was the building of the moral character of the people. Now, it wasn't a great challenge at that time. There was a national character already. They wanted to maintain that. They studied carefully, and they studied the scriptures. And when you read the letters that they sent back and forth, you will find that 1 out of 10 of every sentence, of all of the sentences, were quotations from Scripture. They had theological arguments about this new nation and what they could do and what they shouldn't do. And they saw the pattern of Israel in the Bible, biblical Israel, and how Israel came into this new land of Canaan and how God gave them instructions on how to build a nation that would be maintained and exist for many, many years. And he gave the 10 Commandments specifically for the nation. Many people view it as a pathway to salvation. It is not. Rather, it is the basic rules. It's a basic doctrine for setting up a country. If you love your neighbor, you're not going to steal from him. If you don't steal from him, it's far more likely he's not going to shoot you. He's not going to be upset with you. If you don't covet his wife, you begin looking at the basics of this and you realize this is how you live together as a society. And so they plastered the 10 Commandments absolutely everywhere. As the speaker in the House sits, she, or times he, can look forward and see a depiction of Moses. If you go into the Supreme Court, you will see references to the 10 Commandments and to Moses. Throughout Washington, in fact, you can take a walk. It takes several days to go through and see all the places where the 10 Commandments are still acknowledged, written, or in some places, placed so that someone will be reminded of them, or something is there to honor God. It was so much the heart of this nation. What happened to change all that? And it happened for many of us in our lifetimes. I went to school before 1963. Okay, I was there. I was in high school when the law was changed. And before that, we'd go in homeroom each morning. We would have someone read from the Bible. If they were Jewish, they'd read from the Old Testament. And then we would have a word of prayer. Quite often it was just the Lord's Prayer. And that's how we started our day. And it was the acknowledgement that everybody was giving that there was a God, that there was an authority above everything, and that ultimately there was a source to the moral righteousness that existed. But since then, there has been a revolution in America, another revolution. It's been a quieter revolution, but it's been in some ways equally profound, perhaps even more so. There has been a socialist revolution because that's the ultimate end of it. Shortly after World War I ended, a group was founded by a small coterie of atheists and secularists, all socialists, pledged to fundamentally change the United States of America into a secular and socialist nation. And instead of reaching out to God, this group of counter-revolutionaries prayed to the courts for relief. And they have been effective in using the court system to reconstruct America in almost every area, including our legal system, education, marriage, the press, abortion, religion, social justice, transgenderism, freedom of speech, and numerous other areas. Where did it start? The Red Scare. You may or may not have heard of that. But the American Socialist Revolution began in 1919 in the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. November 7th, 1917, per our calendar, October 25th per the calendar they were using in Russia at that point, the old Julian calendar, hence it's called the October Revolution. The Bolsheviks took over Russia in a coup d'etat. Then April 29th, 1919, there was the Red Scare. Authorities discovered a strategic plan to mail 36 booby-trapped, dynamite-filled bombs to prominent members of the U.S. Political and economic establishment, including J.P. Morgan Jr., John D. Rockefeller, Oliver Wendell Holmes, and U.S. Attorney General Alexander Mitchell Palmer. June 2nd, 1919, a few months later, 8 bombs simultaneously exploded in 8 cities throughout America. One of the bombs, which exploded in Washington, D.C., killed the bomber, who was an Italian-American anarchist. After this close call, Attorney General Palmer ordered the U.S. Justice Department to launch what has become known as the Palmer Raids. September 2nd, 1920, Wall Street was bombed near Federal Hall National Memorial and the J.P. Morgan Bank. 38 died, 141 were injured. And so there was widespread fear that the communist revolution that had taken place in Russia was coming here, that this was a worldwide sequence of events, and that we were next. And that fear was palpable throughout the United States. And so A. Mitchell Palmer, the Attorney General, created the Federal Bureau of Investigation under J. Edgar Hoover to root out the anarchists. November 7th, 1919, the second anniversary of the Russian Revolution, over 10,000 suspected communists and anarchists were arrested and imprisoned under the Sedition Act. One of the people arrested was a man named Roger Baldwin. Now, he was later released, but what happened at his release changed everything. When Baldwin was released, his friends held a big party. They had concluded that the form of anarchist revolution that had been successful in Russia would not work here. And they spoke about it at the party. Christianity and freedom, they said, were too deeply embedded in our national culture and national psyche. And they had to be rooted out. So they set out to use a more subtle approach, a more nuanced approach, working within the system to completely change the system. And so was founded the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, by Roger Baldwin and his friends at that garden party. Who was Roger Baldwin? It's likely that most people here have never heard his name before. Well, he was a Marxist who became the first director of the ACLU and ran it for 30 years. Here's what he said in his college yearbook. Quote, "I am for socialism, disarmament, and ultimately for abolishing the state itself as an instrument of violence and compulsion. I seek the social ownership of property, the abolition of the propertied class, and sole control of those who produce wealth. Communism is the goal," unquote. And then he wrote in a letter in 1917 to a fellow traveler that there was a false image that he wanted to portray regarding the ACLU. He said this, "Do steer away from making it, that is the People's Council, looking like a socialist enterprise. Too many people have already gotten the idea that it is 9/10 a socialist movement. We want also to look like patriots in everything we do. We want to get a lot of good flags, talk a good deal about the Constitution, and what our forefathers wanted to make of this country, and to show that we're the folks that really stand for the spirit of our institutions." He wrote that in a letter to his friend Louis Lochner in 1917. Now, how do you change the laws of a nation? More specifically, how do you change the Constitution? We know there is a process for amending the Constitution, and it was intentionally made very, very difficult by our founders, so that it required overwhelming support from the population to make the slightest change. Well, they knew that it was impossible for them to get public opinion to change so that they could amend the Constitution. Their goal was to amend the Constitution so that they could change public opinion. So they chose to change the meaning of the words of the law rather than changing the law as written. And they did this using the principle of stare decisis. That's from the Latin phrase stare decisis et non quiete movere, which means maintain what has been decided and do not alter that which has been established. And it's the legal principle by which judges are obliged to obey the precedents established by prior decisions, sometimes even precedents with which they disagree. And you know, just from following the Supreme Court, that it is difficult to change a precedent. And so they selected cases that would make slight changes in direction, just like turning an aircraft carrier around a little bit and a little bit and a little bit and a little bit, case by case, carefully selecting cases that would move the law in its interpretation in the direction that they were seeking to move it. So the Scopes trial could be argued. The public schools should be required to teach both evolution and creation. That's what the ACLU argued in that first Scopes case. Today, that would not be the argument at all. It would be there is no basis on which you could teach evolution in the schools because that would in some way abridge the separation of church and state. In fact, that concept of separation of church and state is not in the Constitution. It is not in the Bill of Rights. It has been added over the years through these slight incremental changes. So who were the founders of the ACLU? I'll read off some names. Some you'll recognize, some you won't. John Dewey, Clarence Darrow, Norman Thomas, Upton Sinclair, Agnes Smedley, Roger Baldwin, Jane Addams, Paul Kelloff, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, Felix Frankfurter, Crystal Eastman, Max Eastman, Charles Beard, Abraham Must, Oswald Garrison Villard, and Lillian Wald. I'll share with you just a few of them, okay? And so it'll give you a flavor for who these folks were. Norman Thomas. He was Socialist Party candidate for president 6 times. He was the son of a Presbyterian minister. He attended Princeton and Union Theological Seminary, and he subsequently became an atheist. At Union Theological Seminary, at that time, it was a center of the social gospel movement in extremely liberal politics, progressive politics. And so he embraced atheism and socialism while a student at Union Theological Seminary. And then he joined the Socialist Party of America. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. Now, let me share a little background on how I started this study. I was living in New Jersey at the time, which was more than 25 years ago, and some case had just been decided, and the ACLU had been actively involved. And I had heard of the ACLU before, and I knew people who were in the ACLU. There are many good attorneys who are in the ACLU. Not all share the viewpoint of the founders. Not all are bought into this whole approach of using it as a vehicle to change the laws in this way. And I wanted to find out, who is the ACLU? What do they do? And so I went to the library. This was before the internet. And this was when you had to go through the card catalog and I'm going through the catalog and going through the stacks. And I was there all day long before I finally started to find something about the ACLU. And it was just like one little thread. And then that started leading me to other things as well. And then I came upon Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. No, I'd never heard her name before. And I went to several different places, and it said, for more information, you will find her library and information on her at the American Communist Party Museum in New York City. So I thought, oh, well, that's interesting. Now, today you can just go to cpusa.org and you'll find a lot about her. But she was a director of the ACLU. She was candidate for Congress in New York City as a socialist. She was a writer for the Daily Worker, which was the major communist newspaper at that time. She was president and national chairman of the American Communist Party for much of her life. And she was ultimately charged under the Alien Registration Act with advocating the violent overthrow of the U.S. government. She had a 9-month trial. That's a long trial. And she spent 5 years in jail. She left the country. She returned later, and I'll tell you in a moment what happened. But when she died, she was given a state funeral in Red Square, September 1964. You can look that up in your Encyclopedia Britannica, because that's where I found that. When she returned home, and let me read this. Finally, Elizabeth returned home to New York. One of the first things she did was to go to the offices of the Communist Party in Union Square and become a member. The American Civil Liberties Union then welcomed her return by voting her a seat on their board of directors. You'll find that in the Tamm Library and the Robert F. Wagner Archives. This is stuff that squirreled away, but it's there. Hard to imagine, isn't it? Upton Sinclair, a muckraker, a writer, best known as the author of The Jungle, a book about the horrors of the meatpacking industry in Chicago's back of the yards district. He was the Socialist Party candidate for Congress in New Jersey and also the Socialist Party candidate for governor in California. He was religious as a boy and became an atheist as an adult. And he wrote this, the prophets, well, this is one of his things that he wrote, the prophets, and that's Profits, of religion, an essay in economic interpretation, wrote it in 1917, and I'll just quote something that'll give you a sense for what he wrote. Most clergymen are hypocrites, but they are not entirely to blame. Like other men, they are victimized by the competitive wage system, which presents them with the alternative, either swindle or starve. Agnes Smedley. Now, Whittaker Chambers, you may remember his name, he identified her as a Communist Party member. She was an atheist. And on January 1st, 1948, the Chicago Tribune carried a story claiming that Smedley was being investigated as part of a communist espionage ring based in Japan during the 1930s. Clarence Darrow, you've probably heard his name before. Great litigator, very skilled, great speaker. He was the atheist son of an agnostic Unitarian minister. Surprising how many of these are kids of ministers. He was a committed socialist. The first ACLU trial was the famous Scopes monkey trial, in which the schools in Tennessee were teaching evolution, and the ACLU came in on behalf of John Scopes to say they were teaching creation, and the ACLU came in on behalf of John Scopes saying they need to be teaching as well evolution. And so the questions were, can evolution be taught in the public schools? Yes or no? Well, the court decided no. Darrow lost the case, but he won the war. It was played out in the press. The press was not exactly one-sided, or at least not the side you would have thought. And so he was a founding member of the ACLU as well. John Dewey, now here's somebody you should have heard of, the father of modern American education. Virtually every school teacher at some point or another in their education learns about John Dewey. In 1899, he wrote a classic, School and Society. What you may not know is that he was a committed socialist and secularist. He was a self-acknowledged anti-capitalist and anti-Christian. And he was a signer of the Humanist Manifesto, and many people believe that he actually was the principal writer of the Humanist Manifesto. In 1929, after a trip to Russia, he wrote Impressions of Soviet Russia and the Revolutionary World. It was a glowing travelogue, and it praised the educational system in Russia and strongly suggested that we model ours after that. Let me read some things that represent his thinking. Quote, I am convinced that the battle for humankind's future must be waged and won in the public school classroom by teachers that correctly perceive their role as proselytizers of a new faith, a religion of humanity. The classroom must and will become an arena of conflict between the old and new. The rotting corpse of Christianity, together with all its adjacent evils and misery, and the new faith of humanism, resplendent with the promise of a world in which the never-realized Christian ideal of love thy neighbor will finally be achieved. And here's another from his book, A Common Faith, in 1934. Quote, I cannot understand how any realization of the democratic ideal is possible without surrender of the conception of the basic division to which Christianity is committed. That is, there are those who are saved and those who are not saved. And then he continues on, there is no God and there is no soul. Hence, there are no needs for the props of traditional religion. With dogma and creed excluded, then immutable truth is also dead and buried. In other words, there are no absolutes. There is no room for fixed natural law or moral absolutes, unquote. That's our school system. Felix Frankfurter, you might have heard his name. He was, at one point, he was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States of America, retiring in 1962. He was an Austrian who came here at the age of 12, was a naturalized citizen. He was a law professor at Harvard, studied at Harvard before that. He was an ACLU founder. He was their legal counsel for the first generation or so. J. Edgar Hoover had this to say about Felix Frankfurter, quote, the most dangerous man in the United States, unquote. Another quote from Hoover, a disseminator of Bolshevik propaganda, unquote. Now, J. Edgar Hoover, some question his intentions and the rest, but he certainly sought to protect our nation in many different ways. Frankfurter was an advisor to Franklin Roosevelt and ultimately wound up getting appointed to the court. The assumption was that he would be a moderate. And in some ways, he was conservative in some of his opinions. But there were others, not so much. Oh, here's another person on the Supreme Court. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, General Counsel to ACLU, not a founder. Supreme Court Justice from 1993 to the present. The July 14th LA Times of last year had an article quoting the prior Sunday's New York Times Magazine. Quote, here's what Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg said in that article. So now these are her words, as quoted by the New York Times. Frankly, I had thought that at the time Roe v. Wade was decided, there was concern about population growth, and particularly growth in populations that we don't want to have too many of. There's a tinge of racism there. Eugenics. Congressional report in 1931 reviewed the American Civil Liberties Union. There was a special House committee to investigate communist activities in America. And the ACLU came under the magnifying glass or under the microscope And here is what that report said. Quote, "The American Civil Liberties Union is closely affiliated with the communist movement in the United States, and fully 90% of its efforts are on behalf of communists who have come into conflict with the law. It claims to stand for free speech, free press, and free assembly, but it is quite apparent that the main function of the ACLU is to attempt to protect the communists in their advocacy of force and violence to overthrow the government, replacing the American flag by a red flag and erecting a Soviet government in place of the Republican form of government guaranteed to each state by the federal Constitution." Unquote. Now, those are pretty inflammatory words. And I would urge you to study this for yourself. Clearly, this moves into political arena and everything else, and sometimes you'll find inflammatory statements that may or may not be true. But what you may have seen from what I've presented is that there was a definite agenda on the part of most of the people who were involved in the founding of the ACLU. And it does not match the historical philosophies of this nation, nor does it match the bases on which our great nation was founded. In fact, a primary goal was to change the foundation of the nation. Now, this is a tough thing. Replace the foundation without having the house crumble in the meantime. Now, I believe if they're fully successful, the house will ultimately crumble. And we've already seen a lot of the cracks in the foundation in our lifetime. George Washington, remember, he said, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." The great concern that was expressed in those days before the nation was founded was, as soon as the people can vote and they can get money from the Treasury for themselves, they will vote in their own self-interest. And what we see around the world is nations where we have sought to implement democratic governments have been unable, in many cases, to keep those governments in place because of the competing desires of the people. And so you really need a particular kind of person to go into the voting booth who is going to be voting for what is best for everyone. You need a particular kind of person who is representing us in Congress, who is going to be voting not selfishly, but for what is best. And at the very least, you would hope they would vote for what is best for their constituency and not for themselves. James Madison said this: "We have staked the whole future of American civilization not on the power of government, far from it. We have staked the future of all of our political institutions upon the capacity of mankind for self-government, upon the capacity of each and all of us to govern ourselves, to control ourselves according to the 10 Commandments of God." The 10 Commandments. They talked about it. It was intentional. It wasn't accidental. Patrick Henry. Remember Patrick Henry, "Give me liberty or give me death"? He said, "It cannot be emphasized too strongly or too often that this great nation was founded not by religionists but by Christians, not on religions but on the gospel of Jesus Christ. For this very reason, peoples of other faiths have been afforded asylum, prosperity, and freedom of worship here." Joseph Story, who was at one time back in the 1800s, Supreme Court Justice, he was also a congressman before that. In 1829, he spoke at Harvard, and he said this: "There never has been a period of history in which the common law did not recognize Christianity as lying at its foundations." Consider that. Common law. Not just the United States of America, but common law. At its base is Christianity. And in his work, which was titled "A Familiar Exposition of the Constitution of the United States," that he wrote in 1840, he said this: "We are not to attribute this prohibition of a national religious establishment to an indifference to religion in general, and especially to Christianity, which none could hold in more reverence than the framers of the Constitution. At the time of the adoption of the Constitution, the general, if not the universal, sentiment in America was that Christianity ought to receive encouragement from the state so far as was not incompatible with the private rights of conscience and the freedom of religious worship. And then he went on to say, any attempt to level all religions and to make it a matter of state policy to hold all in utter indifference would have created universal disapprobation, if not universal indignation. And then in his commentary on the First Amendment's original meaning, he clarified what he was talking about, and he said, quote, the real object of the First Amendment was not to countenance, much less to advance Mohammedanism or Judaism or infidelity by prostrating Christianity, but rather to exclude rivalry amongst Christian sects or denominations and to prevent any national ecclesiastical patronage of the national government. What he is saying is when they met to find the wording of the First Amendment, their goal was to find a way for the people who were there in that august body, who came from 5 different Christian groups, to deal with the issue that they were struggling with at the time. Which one of the 5 groups would be the state church of the United States of America? Because it turns out that as they met, 11 of the states had state churches funded by the states. Virginia had disestablished their state church under the guidance of Thomas Jefferson. Rhode Island, because Roger Williams had been treated so poorly in Massachusetts colony as a Baptist going into a Congregationalist colony, that when he got his own charter for a colony, he declared that there will be no state church, and there was no state church in Rhode Island. But at the time that the First Amendment was passed, 11 state churches existed. The last state church to be disestablished, by the way, anybody who was against that were disestablishmentarianists. So there you go. You got something of great value this morning that you can take home and actually use. What used to be the longest word in the English language before supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. That's the background. It's a church word. It's a government word. The last one to be disestablished in 1838 was Massachusetts, the state of Massachusetts. Believe it or not, funded their state church until 1838. So what we know is that the First Amendment was not intended to exclude everything related to God from the public square. And you can see what's been happening as they've done everything they could to try to scratch off, carve off, paint over, whatever, the remnants of the past. And it's been hard. And it's still there. And thankfully, it's still there in the hearts of so many different people. I don't know that we'll ever get back to where this nation was. My hope is that there's a better future, even than what the past was, as people grapple with what the real meaning of these things might be. And so, as we are here today, I would encourage you to pray for our nation. I would encourage you to be gracious as you speak with people who hold different opinions. But hopefully, this morning, you've picked up a few facts that will encourage you to study even further and find out more. Because I am absolutely convinced that knowledge is the critical item. Hopefully, knowledge in which the power of God is made manifest as it is shared. Because so much of what we're dealing with is intentional ignorance. The covering over of true facts from the past and even the present. Even the present. And so my prayer would be that as we go from this place, we might be voices to encourage people and to help them to understand that ultimately praising God and embracing him in our society and even in our government works only for the good of all the people, whether or not they know him. Well, join me as we have a word of prayer. Father in heaven, we want to thank you for the knowledge that you provide, that you make available to us so easily and so readily now, particularly with the advent of the internet. Help us, Lord, that we might be wise and that we might be beacons of light and an encouragement to others. I pray it in Jesus' name. Amen.